Are you a healthcare professional looking for a trusted concussion resource? Then you've come to the right place. From her New York City studios, welcome to Concussion Corner with your host, Dr. Jessica Schwartz.
And now, a word from our sponsor. Did you know that sport helmets are rated on a 5-star system similar to cars? And the safest helmets have nothing to do with price, brand, or availability? Since 2011, Virginia Tech researchers have been providing unbiased helmet ratings that allow consumers to make informed decisions when purchasing helmets. The helmet ratings are the culmination of over a decade of research identifying which helmets best reduce concussion risk. This work is done as part of Virginia Tech's service mission and is 100% independent of any funding or influence from helmet manufacturers. Our mission at Concussion Corner is to expose you, the listener, to trusted spaces in the concussion arena that translate to clinic next day. Please visit the Virginia Tech Helmet Lab website in our show notes or at bit.ly/Virginia Tech Helmets and spread the word to aid in lowering concussion risk in your community. Thank you for tuning in, and let's begin the show. Welcome to Season 4 of Concussion Corner. My name is Dr. Jessica Schwartz, and I'm thrilled to have Dr. Julie Stamm with us today. Dr. Stamm is a clinical assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She brings a unique perspective on the issues of repetitive head impacts in youth sports as a scientist and expert in the field, an anatomist with knowledge of childhood development throughout the body and the brain, and an athletic trainer who has provided medical care for athletes in a variety of sports. She received her doctorate in Anatomy and Neurobiology from the Boston University School of Medicine. She conducted her doctoral research under mentor Robert Stern at the Boston University CTE Center, as well as with Drs. Martha Shenton and Inga Koerte at the Psychiatry Neuroimaging Laboratory, Harvard Medical School, and Brigham Women's Hospital. She received her bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in Kinesiology-Athletic Training, and she spent a year as a graduate assistant athletic trainer at Boston University. As an avid sports fan and three-sport high school athlete from a small town in Wisconsin, she values the importance of sports participation for children. She believes all children should be able to gain the many benefits of sports without long-term consequences from repetitive head impacts. Julie, welcome to the Concussion Corner podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And, I was just reading your bio there. It's so cool that you got to actually become full circle from being a student undergrad and then actually coming a professor on staff. So that's got to be really nice for you to go literally full circle.
Yeah. My office was 2 doors down from my program coordinator, and my professors are my colleagues. So it's awesome. Yeah.
Oh, that's awesome. That's got to be a good feeling to kind of come home, really.
Absolutely. I love it there.
Oh, awesome. So, I just spoke with Kelsey Brick, and she was in Winnipeg, Canada, and it's -40 there. So I can only imagine what's going on in Wisconsin at this time.
Not that bad. It's
Okay.
actually been a mild winter, but it's still, about 18 degrees today. So.
Oh, golly. Yeah, I know. We made a pact, my family and I, to not complain about any cold in the winter. We're just happy to be out during 2021 COVID times and being safe. So we've definitely been bundling up this year.
Absolutely. And at least, typically it would be, single digits or negative at this point in the year. So it could be a lot worse. And we're just glad to be able to be outside and not be too cold.
Indeed. All right. So, I wanted to kick off this podcast. And again, you're new to the podcast and you've been doing wonderful work. I've been following your work for years now. And it's just so wonderful to have folks like yourself come on and literally full circle for me, kind of the work that I've been keeping on my computer and reading and annotating and taking notes and teaching about for years. Really get to chat with you and kind of the origin stories of kind of how you entreed into concussion. And you're actually having a book come out this summer. And we're in March right now, so it's going to be Brain Injury Awareness Month. So going to be doing all sorts of education there. So I would love to hear kind of a little bit about your origin stories and kind of how you entreed into concussion, and then we'll kind of hop into all of your specialty areas and really highlight what you know.
Awesome. Yeah. So I came into it as an athletic trainer. I was a student athletic trainer who really I wanted to do research. I was very interested in getting my PhD and following that path, but I didn't really know what I was interested in until I was at a high school for a clinical rotation. and we had a young high school athlete who had a concussion. We had a lot in that particular stretch in preseason camp. And this one particular athlete just didn't get better. And it didn't seem like a really severe concussion to start with. But as we know, that doesn't always, how bad the symptoms are. Sometimes, they can linger for a long time. But this particular athlete really just didn't get better for quite a long time. And it really got me interested in, in particular, youth concussions and the brain and, what's happening when we're having concussions, or eventually I got into, what happens when we hit our head when we're young. This was impacting his entire life, school, friends, everything. And so I became interested in that and went out to Boston University. I was an athletic trainer, as you said, there for a year on staff, and then went into the PhD program. And I met Dr. Stern and made my way into the CTE Center there. And I started learning more about the long-term consequences there as well, and studied CTE. And I was really interested in what happens when we hit our heads a lot as children. So obviously hitting our heads in general, we're learning with CTE over time was not a good thing, but what about when we're kids and our brain is so rapidly developing? And getting my degree in anatomy, I've been learning a lot about that development and how that was happening. And so that's kind of how I got into that kind of niche in the research.
Awesome. And, one of the key themes that, has come up in your literature and your research is really the terms repetitive head trauma and age of first exposure. So before we get into that, I would love for you to discuss, why is the young brain so vulnerable? And then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We used to think that the young brain, because of all of the plasticity and development that was happening, that if something was perturbed or something happened when we were young, we could just work around it, compensate, and we'd be fine. That plasticity gave us better outcomes than if that happened when we were adults. And while there are some cases where that's true, we're learning that it's really not quite, it doesn't quite work that way. That we may be compensating, but there's a cost to that. And it doesn't always work the way we think it does. So the brain, there are so many processes happening in the brain, and much of that happens when we're really, really young, in our infant toddler time. But there's development happening even in some cases into our 20s and 30s. And the bulk of that, though, is still happening, pre-puberty. And even though it does continue a long time before that. Some of the things that we've looked at are things like myelination. There's laying down that layer that's helping us increase that speed of conduction. That's happening throughout childhood, and there are peaks in different structures at different times. Some structures don't myelinate until far later. Some myelinate a lot earlier. There are things happening like we're laying down so many synapses when we're children. And at some point, often around puberty, but it differs by structure, we hit a peak of synapses and then we prune them away. So we create so many synapses that we end up having too much noise. And we need to just keep the strong connections and get rid of the ones that are just causing a little bit too much noise. So we start pruning those away. And there's so many processes happening that we could potentially influence by hitting our heads a lot. And there's a lot of evidence that that happens with other things, right? So, there are other things that influence the brain, like, lead poisoning affects children more than adults, for example. We know that adverse childhood events affects children and changes the brain when we're older. So I was really interested in what's happening, with physical trauma to the brain when we're young.
It's interesting that, from a point there, just to interject really quick, I've probably honestly only had this conversation probably less than 5 times with other clinicians. But I've actually seen some of the developmental stuntedness with some folks that I've had who've had repetitive head injuries and multiple concussions with very long-term consequences. These children have been put on, SSI disability to be blunt. And what I've actually found is that it's actually very similar to some of this stunting, emotional cognitive stunting that you kind of see with drug addicts that I've worked with in my career. So it was actually interesting to see kind of, the majority of said patients, head injuries, happened before 14. And if you kind of look at the behavior, of this young man in his 20s and, coming up into his 30s, a lot of it stunted to kind of where he essentially stunted, with his head injuries as a young child from sport. So it was interesting to see from a clinical perspective, again, that I'm an N of one, but I've had 2 or 3 patients like that, and it seems to be interesting. That's kind of where they stay.
Yeah, yeah. And I think it's really interesting too, because I don't think that we've really looked at that well in research. I think that a lot of times, we see somebody who's in their 20s or 30s who struggles with, executive functions, planning, judgment, things like that. And we don't look at a concussion when they're 8 or, something that happened when they're that young, because it's so far in between and they seemed to be okay. But an 8-year-old isn't supposed to have executive functions that are well developed. So we're not going to see these deficits until they come online. So I think that's something that we really need to look at a lot more.
I'm just curious because you are expert in brain developments. Why, age 12, why age 14? Again, we
Mhm.
heard you speak about puberty and the bulk of these synapses happening by or before. I'm just curious, were these numbers pulled out of a hat, or, if we're looking at age of first exposure at 12 and, flag football encouragement under 14, were these numbers pulled out of, scientific rationale or out of a hat? And it's kind of my softball question to you.
Yeah, such a good and such an important question too. Age 12 is not perfect for everything.
Mhm.
So in our first research study, we used age 12 because there's so much happening around that time, and what we were looking at in the study, it kind of made sense that it was a reasonable choice for a cutoff. So, one study we did with the corpus callosum, anterior corpus callosum has a peak developmental time around that 8 to 11, 8 to 12 range. And this is particularly in men. You should note that women tend to be a little bit earlier in a lot of these cutoffs, but we haven't
Mhm.
studied women yet in my research. So what fits well for male development um, doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same for female development, female athletes. So that's something that also very much needs to be studied. But the corpus callosum having that cutoff, that was a logical uh, cutoff point to make for that structure. And with our early studies, it kind of made sense. With the hippocampus reaches that peak around age 12 as well. Same with the amygdala. So based on neurodevelopment, it was a logical cutoff. Our
Mhm.
thalamus study that we did, the thalamus doesn't reach that cutoff. It's more protracted. It's just a little bit longer development, and it doesn't really reach its peak until around 14 or 15. So we
Okay.
looked at that as a continuous variable because it didn't make sense to use an age 12 cutoff. And I think that's a really important thing in this research, that whatever structure or function we're studying, we really need to design it based on that structure or function. I know there was another study that used whole brain FA in former NFL players and didn't see a difference based on when they started. But these white matter pathways develop at such different trajectories that if
Mhm.
we're combining them together, we shouldn't see a difference. We shouldn't expect to anyway. So I think that's a really important point about how it's designed. Um, we really need to design that. And I think age 12 is a reasonable cutoff for a lot of different functions and structures.
Mhm.
It's not going to be perfect for every function and structure, though.
Mhm. And, and just, tying into the thalamus from your 2017 paper, the conclusion, let me just see my notes here. We found, you found that, and your team found that, thalamic atrophy was associated with exposure to repetitive head impacts in professional fighters. So I'd wonder if you would, just go into a little bit about what the purpose of the thalamus is in the brain and, essentially what you found, and any other findings that have been associated with any of the studies on age of first exposure and repetitive head trauma.
Yeah, so with the thalamus paper, so we looked at the former NFL players, and it's also been found in boxers. With the Lou Rovo Center has looked at that in boxers as well. And when we looked at our former NFL players, we did see a smaller thalamus in those who started earlier. And the thalamus is a major relay station in the brain. So many different pathways relay through the thalamus, either to or from the cortex, elsewhere, or so many different pathways go through the thalamus. So we found that it was smaller in those who had started earlier, in particular on the right, which I think was interesting, perhaps because language develops earlier than it's one of the more early developing functions anyway. So that's housed on the left side of the brain. So it may be that some of those connections in the left thalamus are built earlier. So it may not have been as affected because it was already established.
Okay.
A theory, I can't say that for sure, but that
Mhm.
may be one reason why we didn't see it in the left, but we did see more significant differences in the right.
Got it.
Yeah.
And this study in 2017 was based off of 214 former football players without other contact sport history. So I'm sure that was tough because I'm sure a lot of them folks play multiple sports. And just looking at the instrumentation used, you used a behavior rating inventory of executive function, adult version metacognition index, behavioral regulation index, a BRI. Depression and apathy scale, evaluation scale, and if I'm missing anything else. In terms of instrumentation used on a recent study by the CARE Consortium with Dr. Jacqueline Cachesse, who's on the podcast this month as well, and Kelsey Brick, Grant Iverson, and the whole CARE Consortium crew, all of those lovely researchers putting in the time and work that you have as well. They use the balance error scoring system, the BEST, the brief symptom inventory, the BSI-18, and the impact testing, and their findings suggested that repetitive head injury during early adolescence is unrelated to brain health, as measured by these specific outcomes in collegiate student athletes. And they had about a 6,000 N based off of the CARE Consortium data that's already in the system. So I was just wondering if you could maybe potentially compare and contrast maybe some hypothetical theories or hypotheses here of why there would be different findings.
Yeah, and this is also so important to talk about. So let me just back up for just a moment. We talked about the Thalamus study. We also did research with our former NFL players where we saw differences in executive functioning and learning and memory based on neurocognitive testing. And we saw differences. So that was a Wisconsin card sort test and a list learning test. And we saw differences with neuroimaging with the corpus callosum. As I mentioned, those who started younger had, in that case before age 12, because it made sense developmentally to use the cutoff, they had lower FA, suggesting more a lack of integrity in the anterior corpus callosum. And actually, one measure that suggested potentially reduced myelination in the anterior corpus callosum in those who started younger. And then those are mostly all in the same group of NFL players. A completely separate group of former football players that spanned people who played high school, college, and professionally, roughly a third each, slightly less than the high school group. They had more difficulties with apathy, and depression as well, and self-reported executive function. So
Was that the 2018 limbic system study?
that was Alasko was the lead author on that one. Yeah, and so those are two separate groups. And then there's other evidence that it may accelerate aging accelerate degeneration in CTE, in a completely separate group of people who had passed away who were passed away and were diagnosed with CTE. They had an earlier onset of symptoms. And I think that's a really important thing to tie in with this, because all of these studies had a much older group of individuals that we were looking at. And the CARE Consortium studies are looking at individuals who are in college now, so a substantially different age group. And I think it's really interesting that perhaps maybe, first off, I should say, you mentioned the differences in the measurements that were used. I think there are some questions about impact. There's reliability questions in general sometimes. And I think that it can be a very useful tool post-concussion. We don't know that it's able to see something as subtle as what we're looking for in that group. So that may be one explanation there. The cerebellum has a little bit more protracted development. So using BESS may or may not quite fit with that age cutoff. That's something that we could definitely look into more closely and look at whether or not that age cutoff should be shifted a little bit for the BESS. But I think it's an interesting thing to look at, especially looking at some of the interesting research coming out with lower extremity injuries following concussion or repetitive trauma potentially. So that may be part of it. I think though that aside from all that, we may be just seeing a picture being painted that shows us that these deficits aren't visible when they're young. It may be that it's when we see these consequences interacting with aging or neurodegeneration, that's when it really comes out. So I like to use the comparison that, if you have two cars on the highway, exact same make, burn gas at the same level, and they would both be starting with a full tank, but then we take some of the gas out of the tank in one of the cars. They're going to go for a really long time at the same speed and have no problems. They're going to look identical and function the same way. But the one that started with less gas in the tank is going to run out first. So maybe what's happening is, from what we're seeing, deficits in older individuals but not in young individuals, maybe what's happening is by hitting our heads a lot as a kid, we're never fully developing all of those connections, all of that myelin, what we should be laying down. And we're ending up with less neuronal, gas in the tank, if you will. And maybe we're just running out of gas sooner because we have less reserve that we're starting with. So this is all, my thought on what this might be telling us, this combination of research. Obviously, we need a lot more research to figure all of this out, but I think that's an interesting potential, that maybe it's just that we're decreasing reserve, and maybe we're not going to see these deficits until we're older, which in itself presents a challenge because we're horrible as humans at thinking ahead and thinking, well, if I don't do this, I need to not do this now because, 2 weeks from now, it might be a problem. Thinking about that 40 years from now.
I mean, we're even seeing that with this novel pandemic. I mean, for with a 10 days to 2 week symptom time, and then also even with obesity. I mean, it's just like we're seeing, 2/3 of our kids are overweight or obese here in the U.S. and the U.K. So yes, it makes sense that we wouldn't be thinking ahead like that for
Absolutely.
brain health.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah, and so it's definitely interesting, and I think it's so important for our listeners to kind of lean in and tune into that of what you just said, because again, as we have another like 5 to 10 minutes left here on this episode. I think it's so important because if we step away from all of this and just have the conversation as not Dr. Stamm and not Dr. Schwartz here, and we just have the conversation of, hey, Julie, you don't want to grab some lunch? Sure, Jess, let's do that. Probably hitting your head as a kid is probably not a good idea. And if we just walk away from that, and not to belittle any of your work and your life's work and your thesis and dissertation and PhD education, but again, at the end of the day, we know that we shouldn't be hitting our kids in the head when they're young, or adults either. And it's so refreshing to hear you kind of hypothesize what potentially could be going on based on your life's work as of thus far, and then also to go back and forth with other researchers that we've had on the podcast and that are publishing as of right now that may be finding different things than you found. And the good news is that we need to be having these conversations so that we can refine the research, refine the data, and at the end of the day, we're doing this to help people. So very cool to hear you kind of think that out like live on a podcast.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we have these conversations. I think, right now we're in such a culture that if we hear one thing that validates what we want to believe, then,
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're going to just go with and believe that. And, I think that we're missing out on so much of the story then if we do that. And, one negative finding and one positive finding alone means nothing, right? Until we take it all
Mm-hmm.
together, it can raise awareness and it can make us interested in looking at something else. But I think it's, every positive or negative that we have just tells us more of what we need to look at. So I think it's great that there are so many people starting to look at this now.
Mm-hmm. In terms of youth athletes playing sport and participating in sport, I would love to hear you talk a little bit about the benefits. This is not all doom and
Oh,
gloom. We
yes.
want our kids moving. We want our kids, heck, we want our adults moving too. Especially with what's been going on in the last year with the novel pandemic. But specifically talking about youth athletes, why do we want kids to be moving? Why should they be social? Why should they be participating in cardiovascular activity? Again, these are all what one would think to be softball questions, but at the end of the day, we have had some fear avoidance of parents pulling kids from
Mhm.
youth sports and things like that. So I would love for you to talk on the other end of why we want to get our kids moving.
Yeah, that is my biggest fear of the outcome of my research is that people are going to think, well, I don't want my kid to play sports. That's not what we want, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think, every time I did any kind of interview or talk to anybody about this, I always say that sports are so important for kids. And every kid that wants to play a sport should have the opportunity to play. There are countless benefits um, health-wise. Obviously, I think that seems like the most obvious one. That the cardiovascular benefits, the benefits to health, developing good physical activity habits that will carry throughout life is incredibly important. So that's a huge benefit. Psychologically, I think we're seeing that more now than ever with COVID and with having student athletes not being able to play sports and what
Mm-hmm.
that's done mental health wise. I think it's clearer than ever how important sports are, and especially team sports. All sports provide benefits, but there's a lot of evidence that team sports above and beyond individual sports provide that benefit because you have that team support, you have others to rely on, and the bonds that are formed in sports. I have
Mm-hmm.
friends that I will have forever because I played sports with them. And that is so important for kids, not to mention too the work ethic, the determination, the being able to win with grace and lose with grace, the life skills that we learn in sports that we can apply to other places in life are so important. But I think one important thing to take in a note with that is none of those benefits require you to hit your head. Not
Yes.
one. And there's been no research that says that you have to hit your head to get those benefits.
Mm-hmm.
There was a recent paper that talked about contact collision sports versus non-contact sports, but when you look at that breakdown, almost all of the contact collision sports are team sports, and far more of the um, non-contact sports are individual sports. So that could really be what was driving that. But that's the only thing that has at all suggested that maybe contact sports might have a benefit. But there's really not evidence to say that you have to hit your head to get those benefits. And I can tell you, I didn't play contact sports, and I did not need to hit my head to get those
What
benefits.
were
I
I
played
saw that you were a three-sport athlete. What were your three sports?
Yeah, I played basketball, volleyball, softball. So sometimes basketball gets thrown in one category or the other, but it's not like an inherent repetitive impact sport.
Mm-hmm.
And neither is, same with volleyball and softball. Those sports help shape who I am and how I got to this point in my life doing this work. And I didn't
I
have to
think
hit my
we
head to get that.
Yeah, and I think we have to talk about resilience as well. I mean, I don't know about
Oh,
you as a
yes.
grown-up, but I would much prefer to work with someone who I know was an athlete, whether it be high school or college. And yes, we can relive our glory days. But at the same time, um, just even working in a group project with someone that you knew plays sport, you just knew there was a certain organization, resilience, toughness to kind of push through. So, for me, I'm all for, doing the adult group project and working with folks, in adults, education and academic lives, that have played sport. It just makes a huge difference.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. It's a huge thing for me. Working with athletes is awesome. My coworker right now, who I teach with on a day-to-day basis, is a former athlete, and I think that dynamic actually really helps us in our working relationship. I think that resilience, like you said, is a big thing. There are things that I've done. When I started in my current job, I also teach anatomy, as you mentioned, and I have about 600 students a semester, and I was doing it all by myself,
Oh my
leading
gosh.
13 TAs. I was working about 6 a.m. to midnight every day of the week for a stretch, and I some of these things that I've done, I don't know how I would have gotten through that with the mental toughness that it took to do it without my experience as an athlete. It just kind of laid this foundation. So I think that's so important, that resilience that you build from sports.
Yeah, and I think, not to bring up politics, but I think we saw that, in the recent election times, is that, to be able to lose with grace, I think is,
Mm-hmm.
and with class, you really can't, read that in a book or teach that. Like, you literally have to get knocked down in your life. And by doing that, we lose in sport, and then we walk up with grace in class, and then we congratulate and shake pre-COVID, we shake the other team's hand and say, good game, good game, good game. You might have been crying, or you have to knock some dust off your shoulder, but this is what you did. It's part of the game. Losing is part of winning.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, again,
Absolutely.
so we are encouraging here, to be clear, as we talk about all of this neuroanatomy and science and, potential brain atrophying studies, that we really are encouraging movement and sport. Again, I am a physical therapist first, so you're athletic trainer first. So we want to make sure that folks are getting out there and, safely moving. So awesome notes on all parts there. You have a book coming out in July, in third quarter of this year, 2021, July 2021. It's Brain Injury Awareness Month, and you know I think what we'll do for part two is we'll kind of highlight some of the chapters that you've got going on in this upcoming book, which have definitely been your life's work. Because I looked at all of the chapters and I was like, well, these are essentially all white papers that have been published, and I'm sure some of your work. So I'd love to let the audience kind of give them a sneak peek to what's coming in July. And in the meantime, how can folks find you on social media? What's the best way for folks to reach out? And we'll pull out all of this stuff in the show notes as well.
Yeah, so it's at Julie Stamm PhD on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can find me on LinkedIn as well. I think I post the most on Twitter, but you can find me there. I also have a website. It's just juliestamm.com, so you can find me there too.
Awesome. And yeah, we'll have all of those in the show notes for folks, including your Google Scholar link, and so they can find your work easily. And I look forward to part two of this. And again, it's Brain Injury Awareness Month. It's March. The hashtag is Not Alone in Brain Injury. So we appreciate that. If you could share this podcast with one or two or three of your colleagues, it takes no time to do that. And if you can rate us 5 stars, would be amazing. It really helps us grow. Each podcast takes between 5 and 6 hours to produce and record and upload and the whole nine. And I really believe in free open access medical education. So, just 30 seconds or less of your time makes a huge difference. So I encourage folks to just tell at least one person about us. And we appreciate that. And to get the word out for Brain Injury Awareness Month. So Julie, thanks so much for coming on. We'll have you on for part two and really highlight some more of your work and the book. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Concussion Corner, hosted by Dr. Jessica Schwartz. The information in this podcast is for entertainment purposes only and not to be used as personal medical advice. Don't forget to follow us on social media on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube at Concussion Corner.